The morning Sarah Langston discovered the crack in the earth running through the center of her cornfield. She did not cry, not because she lacked the heartbreak for it, but because she had decided long ago that crying was something she could not afford. It was the summer of 1879, and the Texas Panhandle had not seen rain in 63 days. The sky above the flat, wind-scraped plains of Callahan County stretched on in a merciless, bone-white expanse, the kind of sky that seemed to absorb every prayer a person sent up and return nothing in exchange. The creek that had run along the south edge of her property since her father had homesteaded the land 12 years ago was nothing more than a pale scar in the dirt now, its stones sun-bleached and exposed like the ribs of something long dead. Sarah stood at the edge of her field with her hands on her hips and her jaw set hard, her dark hair pinned beneath a wide-brimmed straw hat that had belonged to her mother. She was 26 years old, and she ran this farm alone. Had been running it alone for 2 years, since typhoid had taken her father in the fall of 1877, leaving her with 160 acres of deeded land, a mule named Moses, a root cellar full of preserves, and a stubbornness that her father had often joked could outlast the devil himself. The corn was dying. She could see it clearly. The lower leaves had curled inward on themselves, their edges gone brown and brittle, and the stalks that should have been chest-high by now stood stunted and yellowing in the cracked ground. The field had been her best gamble this season, planted after a wet April that had promised a good year. And then May had turned dry. June had gone drier still. July had arrived like a furnace door swung open, and August was already showing no mercy. She walked the rows slowly, pressing the dry soil with her boot heel, watching the dust rise. She had been pulling water from her well 3 times a day since June, hand over hand on the rope, hauling bucket after bucket to keep the garden behind the house alive, the vegetable patch that would feed her through winter. The corn was further gone. The corn, she thought with a tightening of her chest, she might have to let go. But letting go was not something Sarah Langston had a talent for. Her nearest neighbor was Peter Watkins, whose property sat adjacent to hers along the northern fence line. She had seen him in town often enough, at Hargrove's General Store or at the feed mill on Saturdays, a tall man of 30 with sandy brown hair and calm gray eyes that seemed to take in a great deal and give back very little. He had come to Callahan County 3 years ago from somewhere east, though he had the look and manner of someone who had spent considerable time under an open sky. He ran cattle mostly, a modest herd of longhorns, along with a well-kept kitchen garden and a wheat field that, everyone in the county knew, sat over an underground spring of remarkable depth and consistency. Peter Watkins had water when nobody else did. That was simply a fact of the land. Sarah was aware of this fact the same way she was aware of a great many uncomfortable truths. She filed it away and did not dwell on it, because dwelling on what other people had, and you did not was, in her philosophy, as useful as shouting at the sky. She had spoken to Peter on perhaps a dozen occasions in the 3 years they had been neighbors. Their interactions were always cordial, occasionally warm, and never personal enough to be called anything more than a civil exchange between 2 people who understood each other primarily through proximity. He had helped her fix a section of fence the previous fall after a windstorm knocked 3 posts flat. She had brought him a pie at Christmas, apple with a lattice crust, and he had thanked her with a quietness that she found, though she would not have admitted it, rather moving. She had also noticed, though she would have argued this point if pressed, that he had a way of looking at her that suggested he was paying more attention than he let on. A steadiness to his gaze that was different from the way other men in the county looked at a widow woman on her own, which was usually with calculation or pity or some uncomfortable blend of both. Peter Watkins looked at her like she was something worth understanding, and that, whether she liked it or not, was difficult to dismiss. She liked it very much. She would never have said so. That afternoon she drove Moses and the wagon into the town of Clearwater, which was what the people of Callahan County called the small collection of buildings that served as their commercial and social center. There was Hargrove's store, a livery, a small church, a schoolhouse that doubled as a meeting hall, a saloon called the Dusty Boot that Sarah had entered exactly once and only because she had been looking for the town doctor, and a water trough outside the post office that was currently bone dry. The drought was the only conversation in town. She overheard it at every stop. Hargrove himself, a broad man with a thick mustache and worried eyes, told her that 2 families on the eastern edge of the county had already packed up and left, headed for New Mexico or California. No one was quite sure which. "It's the worst I've seen it," he said, counting out her change for the salt and the lamp oil she had bought. "And I've been here since '71. "It'll break," Sarah said, with a confidence she did not entirely possess. "Lord willing," said Hargrove. "You managing out there, Miss Langston, alone as you are?" "I manage fine," she said and smiled, and meant it as a closing to the subject which Hargrove, to his credit, understood. On her way out of town, she passed Tom Briggs, who ran the cattle ranch 3 miles south and fancied himself, with considerably more enthusiasm than evidence, as someone she ought to be receptive to marrying. He tipped his hat to her from across the street and called out something about her looking well, and she gave him a polite nod and clicked Moses forward before the conversation could develop. Tom Briggs was not a bad man exactly, but there was nothing about him that made her feel anything other than the mild irritation one feels at a persistent fly in hot weather. She did not think about Peter Watkins on the drive home. Or rather, she thought about him only briefly, in the context of the water and the spring beneath his land, and then she shut the thought down with the efficient firmness she applied to all thoughts that led nowhere useful. That evening, standing at her well and counting the rope marks on her bucket line, she calculated that the water table beneath her property had dropped another 3 feet in the past 2 weeks. The well had not run dry. Not yet, but the corn could not be saved by hand-hauling water. She would need rainfall, or she would need a miracle, or she would need to accept the loss and hope the vegetable garden and the 2 pigs and the chickens could carry her through until spring. She stood at the edge of the well for a long time, looking out across the field in the fading light, the silhouettes of the dying corn stalks cutting against the orange and purple of the evening sky. It was beautiful in the way that hard things often are, beautiful in a way that made her throat hurt. She went inside and cooked a small supper of salt pork and dried beans, and ate it at the table her father had built from cedar planks the first winter they were on the land. His chair sat empty across from her, as it always did, and she ate looking at it without sadness, because she had made her peace with that emptiness, more or less, in the way that people who live alone eventually do. Across the fence line, approximately 400 yards to the north, she was unaware that Peter Watkins was standing at his own window at nearly that same moment, looking south across his land toward hers, watching the light disappear from the sky and thinking very carefully about something he had been thinking about for several weeks. He had noticed the state of her corn. He noticed it because he noticed everything about her land the way he noticed everything about her, with an attention that had grown gradually and steadily over the 3 years they had been neighbors, and that he had made no particular effort to act on because he was, by nature, a patient man, and also because he understood that Sarah Langston was not a woman who responded well to being pushed. He had been at the fence line 2 days ago, checking the post caps on the northern stretch of his property, when he had seen her walking her rows with that particular set to her shoulders that he had come to recognize as her version of distress. She carried trouble the way most people carry a heavy pack, without complaining about it, but with the weight visible if you knew how to look. He knew how to look. His well was deep and rich, fed by the underground spring that had been one of the primary reasons he had chosen this particular parcel of land when he had come west. He had hired a surveyor before purchasing, had done his research methodically, because he was the kind of man who believed in preparation above inspiration. The spring showed no sign of diminishing even in the worst of the drought. He had more water than he needed, water enough for his cattle, his garden, his wheat field, and considerable excess besides. He sat down at his kitchen table and spread out a rough map of both properties that he had sketched himself, studying the elevation between his well and the edge of her corn field. The land ran on a very gentle downward grade from his well northward, and then back southward toward her property. A shallow valley in between that was barely perceptible to the eye, but that was enough, he calculated, to make a gravity-fed irrigation channel entirely feasible. He would need to dig approximately 300 yards of channel, perhaps 4 inches deep and 6 inches wide, cutting across the corner of his property and through the fence line into the northeast corner of her field. He could run water from his well overflow, the excess that bled off into a drainage ditch he had dug east of his barn, into the channel and let it flow south by gravity into her rows. It was not a small undertaking for a single man to accomplish in one night. He sat with this for a while, turning his coffee mug in his hands. He knew, as certainly as he knew his own name, that Sarah Langston would not ask him for help. He understood her well enough to understand that asking would cost her something she was not willing to spend, that her independence was not merely practical but philosophical, that it was wound up in her grief and her pride and her self-conception in ways that were entirely legitimate, and that he respected even as he watched her strain under the weight of a problem he could solve in a single night's work. He could go to her and offer. He had considered this. He had considered the way she would draw herself up straight and look at him with those dark eyes and say that she was managing fine, thank you. In that voice, she used that left no room for argument. He could push past that refusal and insist, but that felt wrong to him, felt like a transgression of something he valued about her. Or he could simply do it quietly in the night and let her wake to water running in her field and draw her own conclusions. He finished his coffee and stood up. He went to bed at his usual hour, perhaps a little earlier than normal, and set the alarm clock on his nightstand for midnight. Sarah, unaware of any of this, also went to bed, and spent perhaps 30 minutes in that uncomfortable territory between wakefulness and sleep, where the mind goes over all the things it is worried about, and finds no resolution for any of them before she finally dropped into a dreamless exhaustion. The alarm pulled Peter out of sleep into the warm darkness of a windless August night. He dressed without lighting the lamp, pulling on his heavy work pants and his oldest shirt, lacing his boots in the dark from memory. He went to the barn and took the short-handled spade and the long-handled trenching tool from the wall and went out into the field. The moon was up, nearly full, which was a mercy. It laid a pale silver light across the flat land, enough to see by, enough to walk a straight line. He stood at the edge of his well overflow and worked out his angles by eye, and then he began to dig. The work was hard and steady. The ground was dry to a considerable depth, baked by weeks of brutal sun, and the trenching tool rang against it with a sound that he kept as quiet as he could manage, though there was no one near enough to hear. He worked methodically, cutting the channel in a slightly curving line that followed the natural grade of the land, keeping it consistent, keeping the bottom level with a careful eye. Sweat ran down his back and soaked his shirt through. The night was warm but not unpleasant, the kind of warm that a man working hard can find almost agreeable, and the sky above was enormous and scattered with stars in the way that the Texas sky always was on a clear night, as though someone had thrown handfuls of light across the dark. He thought about her while he worked. He thought about the way she had looked the first time he had ever truly seen her, not just registered her presence as a neighbor, but actually seen her. It had been at the church social in the spring of 1877, before her father died, and she had been standing with old Mr. Langston under the elm tree at the side of the churchyard, laughing at something he had said, her head thrown back slightly, her whole face open with delight. Peter had been standing 20 feet away with a plate of food he had forgotten to eat, watching her laugh, and had thought something very simple and very clear. That is a person I would like to know. He had then spent the better part of 2 years knowing her only approximately, from a respectful distance, while her father fell ill and then died, and she reorganized her entire life around the task of survival. He had watched from that distance with something that was not pity and not patience alone, but some combination of care and restraint that he had no particularly good word for. He kept digging. He was perhaps halfway to the fence line when the eastern sky began to show the very first suggestion, not light exactly but a lessening of darkness, and he kept his pace. He reached the fence at a post that had a good foot of open space beneath the lowest wire, enough to run the channel under without disturbing the fence structure, and he worked the trench beneath the wire with care, angling it slightly so the flow would carry through. Then he was on her side of the fence, working through the hard outer edge of her field, angling the channel along the northern margin of the corn rows, so that the water, when it ran, would find its way between the roots without washing the soil. He dug for another 40 minutes, his hands burning on the handles, his back aching with the good ache of physical work, until the channel ran the full length he had planned, ending in a shallow spreading basin he dug into the corner of the field, from which the water could fan out along the row bottoms. He went back to his well. He adjusted the overflow pipe, a simple wooden sluice he had built to manage the drainage, angling it now into the head of the new channel rather than the old drainage ditch. He watched the water move. It was slow at first, finding its way along the unfamiliar path, hesitating in the places where the grade was most gentle, and then it began to run in earnest, a thin, bright line of water moving through the silver dark, crossing his land and slipping under his fence and spreading into her field. He stood there in the early darkness watching it for a few minutes with his hands at his sides and the trenching tool leaning against his leg, and he felt something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite longing, and was perhaps some complicated mixture of both. Then he gathered his tools and went home, moving carefully across the field so as to leave no obvious trail of footprints that would announce his presence, and he slipped back into his house and washed his hands and his face and lay down on his bed with his boots still on, and was asleep in minutes. Sarah Langston woke at 5 in the morning as she always did, which was to say before the sun had fully committed to the horizon, when the sky was a deep blue-gray, and the air was as cool as it would get for the next 16 hours. She pulled on her dress and her boots and went out to start the morning chores, moving through the familiar sequence without needing to think about it. Chickens, pigs, Moses, water from the well for the kitchen, check the garden. She was halfway through refilling the garden water barrel when something caught the edge of her attention. A sound, low and consistent, that was out of place in the dry silence she had grown accustomed to. She stood still and listened to it. It was the sound of water, running water. She set the bucket down slowly and turned toward the corn field, and for a moment she simply stood there because what she was seeing did not register immediately as real. There was a thin silver line of water running along the northern margin of her field, catching the early light, moving with the quiet purpose of water that knows exactly where it is going. It ran between the corn rows, spreading in the shallow paths between the stalks, soaking into the cracked earth with an eagerness that she could almost feel from where she stood. She walked to the edge of the field and crouched down and put her hand in the water, and it was cool and clean and real. She followed it backward along the margin of the field to the fence line, where it emerged from a narrow channel dug cleanly beneath the wire. She followed the channel with her eyes northward across the boundary of her land onto Peter Watkins's property, where it disappeared into the pre-dawn dark. She stood at the fence for a long time, her hands still damp, the sound of running water behind her doing something to the inside of her chest that she was wholly unprepared for. She knew, with absolute certainty, who had done this. She put her hand on the fence post and gripped it and breathed. The water was clean. The channel was well made, cut with skill and consistency, angled just right to carry the flow without flooding or washing. Someone had worked most of the night to do this. Someone had planned it carefully, had thought about the elevation and the grade and the placement of the rows. Someone had crossed onto her land in the dark and dug into her field without disturbing a single stalk of corn, and had given her something that she had not asked for, and would not have asked for, and that she needed more desperately than she was willing to admit to anyone, including herself. She pressed her lips together and breathed through her nose and absolutely did not cry, and then she straightened up and went back to her chores because the morning did not wait. But all through the morning, as she fed the chickens and checked on Moses and stoked the kitchen stove and set the coffee to boil, she was aware of the sound of water moving through her field, a small and steady sound that was the most welcome thing she had heard in months, and she kept stopping in the middle of whatever she was doing to listen to it. By mid-morning, she had made her decision. She took off her work apron and smoothed her hair and put on her second-best dress, which was not a formal dress but was considerably more presentable than the one she wore for field work, and she walked north across her property to Peter Watkins's fence line. She paused there for only a moment, and then unlatched the gate that sat in the fence between their properties, a gate she had used perhaps twice in 3 years, and walked across the open ground toward his house. It was a well-kept house, she noticed, as she always noticed when she looked at it from a distance. A frame house with a covered porch, painted a faded white that needed refreshing but was decent enough, with a kitchen garden on the east side that was, even in the drought, showing a great deal more life than hers. There were flowers along the porch rail, something she had not expected, bright orange and yellow blooms in tin cans arranged in a line. It was a detail that surprised her every time she thought about it. She knocked on his door. There was a pause and then footsteps, and then the door opened, and Peter Watkins stood there looking at her with those calm gray eyes of his, and he was clearly exhausted. He was wearing clean clothes, but his face had the particular blankness of someone who had had 2 or 3 hours of sleep and was working to present as normal, and there was a rawness to his hands where the calluses had been worked hard and a small cut along one thumb that was fresh. He had not been expecting her this soon. She could see that in the slight adjustment of his expression, but he recovered quickly, with a steadiness that she found herself noting. "Miss Langston," he said, "good morning." "Good morning, Mr. Watkins," she said. She kept her voice level and her chin up. "I wonder if I might talk with you for a minute." "Of course," he said. He opened the door wider. "Would you like to come in? I have coffee." She considered this. Going inside felt like a different kind of conversation than standing on the porch, but the sun was already climbing and the air was heating fast. "I would," she said. His kitchen was clean and spare, a cast iron stove, a table with 2 chairs, a shelf of books along the east wall that surprised her almost as much as the flowers on the porch. He poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot that sat on the back of the stove and set them on the table, and they both sat down, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "I found a water channel in my cornfield this morning," she said. She watched his face. He did not look away from her. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and said, "I know. It runs from your well. It does." She set her own cup down carefully. She had been thinking about what she wanted to say for the entire walk over, and she had prepared several versions of it, the formal and grateful version, the somewhat cooler version that maintained more distance, the version in which she offered some kind of payment or reciprocal arrangement that would make this feel more like a transaction and less like a gift she had not asked for. And now, sitting across from him at his kitchen table with the morning light coming through the window and his gray eyes watching her steadily, every prepared version evaporated and she said the only true thing. "You should have asked me," she said. "I know," he said again. "That is my land. It is. And my field." "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. "If you had asked me, I would have said no." "I know that too," he said, and there was something in his voice when he said it, not amusement exactly, not condescension, but a kind of gentle honesty that disarmed her more completely than any argument could have. She picked up her coffee cup and held it in both hands, the way he was holding his, which she realized only after she had done it. "The corn was dying," she said. "I know. I was managing. I know you were. I am not the kind of person who cannot manage alone. That is one of the things I am most certain of about you, Miss Langston," he said, and the simplicity of it, the lack of any complication or challenge in how he said it, took the last of her prepared indignation and quietly dissolved it. She looked down at her coffee. Outside the window she could hear birds in the yard and further off the quiet lowing of his cattle. "You worked all night," she said. "Most of it." That was a considerable amount of digging. The ground cooperated well enough considering. She looked up at him again. The morning light made the tiredness in his face very apparent, and beneath it she could see something else, not quite anxiety but something that had some vulnerability to it, something that suggested the steadiness he showed her was not effortlessness but intention. "Why?" she asked. It was the simplest version of a much more complicated question. He was quiet for a moment, turning his cup slowly. "Because your corn was dying and my well was full," he said. "And because I thought you would carry that loss without saying a word about it, and I found that I was not willing to watch that happen if there was something I could do." The kitchen was very quiet. She could hear the clock on the shelf ticking. "That is very forward, Mr. Watkins," she said. "It is," he agreed. "I apologize for crossing onto your land without permission. That was not right, and I should have found a way to ask you even knowing what you would have said." She studied him. He meant it. He was not saying what she wanted to hear. He was saying what was actually true, the apology and the justification existing simultaneously, without canceling each other out. She respected that in a way she was not sure she could have articulated. "The channel is well made," she said finally. "Thank you. The water is reaching the roots. Good. You may want to adjust the spread basin at the end of the row. I eyeballed it in the dark and it might be running a little west." She almost smiled. She pressed her lips together and looked at her coffee. "I would like to pay you for the water," she said. "What you use from your well for my field. That is not necessary." "It is necessary to me," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. "What would you propose?" She thought about what she had to offer that was genuinely useful rather than merely symbolic. "Vegetables," she said. "My garden is holding. Preserves in the fall if the harvest goes as hoped. Help with your wheat harvest. I can drive a wagon and I am good with a scythe." He was watching her in a way that made it difficult to maintain the businesslike tone she was reaching for, but she held it. "That seems more than fair," he said. "Then we have an arrangement," she said. "We do," he agreed. She finished her coffee and stood, and he stood also, because he was that kind of man. "I will check the basin this afternoon and make the adjustment," she said. "I'll come with you if that's agreeable. I'd like to see how the flow is settling." She hesitated for only a moment. "That would be fine," she said. She walked home across the sun-baked ground between their properties, feeling something strange and unsteady moving around in her chest, something she had not felt in a very long time and did not immediately have a name for. He came at 4 o'clock, when the worst of the afternoon heat had begun to relent slightly, and they walked the channel together through her field. He carried a small spade and adjusted the basin at the end of the rows without being asked, widening it slightly on the eastern side, so the spread was more even, and she watched him work with the same efficiency and quietness that characterized everything he seemed to do. They walked the rows after, checking the soil around the roots of the corn, and he crouched down periodically to press his fingers into the earth and assess the moisture level with the practiced attention of someone who understood land. "If the flow holds," he said, "and you keep it running through the heat of the day, you may recover enough of these stalks to make it worth harvesting." "You think so?" She tried to keep the hope out of her voice and mostly succeeded. "The lower third is probably lost," he said honestly, "but the upper 2/3 still have the right color in the stalks. They're stressed but not finished." He stood up and brushed the dirt from his hands. "They've got some fight left in them." "Like their owner," she said before she had decided to say it, and then was annoyed with herself for how it sounded. but he looked at her in a way that was warm and quiet and said, "Yes, exactly like their owner," and nothing about how he said it was teasing. They walked back to the fence in the long evening light, and he stopped at the gate between their properties and turned to face her. The sky behind him was doing something spectacular with orange and red, the kind of sunset that only the Texas flatlands seemed to produce, vast and theatrical and entirely unconcerned with any human drama taking place beneath it. "Thank you for the coffee this morning," he said. "Thank you for the water," she said, "and for what it cost you." He looked at her with a slight furrow between his brows, a question in it. "The night's work," she said. "I know what that costs a person." He nodded slowly. "Good night, Miss Langston. Good night, Mr. Watkins." She watched him walk back toward his house until he was far enough away that watching felt conspicuous, and then she turned and went inside and stood in the middle of her kitchen for a moment with her hands clasped in front of her and her eyes shut, taking stock of herself with the honest and unsentimental attention she applied to her crops and her accounts. She was in considerable trouble, she concluded, of a kind she had not anticipated and was not certain she was equipped to manage. She opened her eyes and set about making supper. The channel ran for 2 weeks. Peter maintained it without being asked, walking its length every other day to clear any debris that had settled in and check the flow. Sarah found herself, on the days he came to her side of the fence to check the basin, inventing reasons to be in that part of the field at the same time, which she understood was not subtle but could not entirely help. They talked while he worked, at first about practical things, the water table, the weather prospects, the state of the corn, and then gradually about other things. She learned that he had come from Ohio, from a family of farmers, and that he had headed west after the death of his younger brother in a farming accident when he was 22, looking for something that he described carefully as open space and a clean start. She heard the grief in that carefully enough not to press it, but she stored it in the same place she stored everything about him. He learned that she had grown up on this land, that she had been 12 when her father had first staked the claim, that she had gone to school in Abilene for 2 years at her father's insistence, and had loved the books and hated being away from the land, that she had been briefly engaged to a young man from Abilene at 19, an engagement she had ended herself when she recognized that what she felt for him was fondness, and what she needed to stay on the land was something stronger than that she had no regrets about this. He listened to all of this with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, and she found that she was not performing for his attention the way she sometimes felt herself doing with other people, that she was simply talking, which was unusual enough for her to notice. On the 15th day after he had dug the channel, the sky broke open. The rain came in the late afternoon with a wind from the north that dropped the temperature 20 degrees in 20 minutes and sent the dust devils spinning across the flat ground before a wall of dark cloud swept in from the horizon, and the whole sky opened up. Sarah was on the porch when it started, and she stood with her arms out at her sides and her face turned up to it and let it hit her, because she had been waiting for 63 days and she had earned this moment. It rained for 4 hours. Not a polite Texas rain, but a furious, generous, biblical rain that filled the creek along her south fence line and turned the road to mud and battered the roof of her house with a sound like drums. She went out in the middle of it and walked her corn field in the rain, and the stalks, already revived by 2 weeks of channeled water, stood up straighter in it, and she put her hand on a stalk and said quietly to her father's memory that they had made it. When the rain broke, the evening was cool and clean and washed bright, and the sky went through pink and gold and finally a deep clear blue, and the stars came out one by one with an extraordinary clarity. She dried off and changed and had just put the kettle on when she heard hooves in her yard. She opened the door and Peter Watkins was standing there in the clean after-rain air with his hat in his hand and his hair damp at the temples, and he said, "I wanted to make sure the channel didn't flood the rows. The flow needs to be redirected now." "I know," she said. "I was about to go check." "I'll do it," he said. "Go easy on yourself tonight." She looked at him. "Come in and have some tea first," she said. "The channel will wait 10 minutes." He came in and sat at her father's old table and she made tea, and they sat across from each other in the quiet after the storm. And she told him about how her father had said this land would prove itself, and how it had, in ways she had not expected. And he listened without trying to say the right thing, which was exactly right. And then he went out and redirected the channel overflow, and she watched him from the porch in the dark, the lantern he carried swinging a small, warm circle of light across the wet field, and she understood quite clearly what she felt. 3 days after the rain, Tom Briggs rode up to her gate at mid-morning with his hat in his hand and his usual air of pleased self-importance, and she went out to meet him at the fence with a resignation she did not entirely hide. "I heard you got the corn through the drought," he said, as if this reflected well on him somehow. "Good news. Listen, Sarah, I've been meaning to have a proper conversation with you for a while now." "Good morning, Tom," she said. He was not deterred by her tone, which was one of his more enduring qualities. He told her that he had a good solid ranch and a decent income from the cattle, and that he thought she had been alone long enough, and that the two properties together would make a very sensible arrangement. He said this, she noted, in almost exactly the order one might draw up a business proposal, with the emotional component arriving last and with rather less enthusiasm than the section about the combined acreage. She let him finish. She respected him enough for that. "Tom," she said. "I am not going to marry you," he blinked. "Now, Sarah, I am going to say this kindly because I think you are genuinely trying to be considerate in your own way," she said. "But my answer is no. It has always been no. I am sorry if that has not been entirely clear." He rode away with the slightly deflated dignity of a man who had expected at least more of a negotiation, and she watched him go, and then turned back to her field, and found Peter Watkins standing at the fence line with a hammer and a handful of staples, working on a loose section of wire, and from the way he kept his attention very deliberately on the fence, she understood that he had arrived recently enough to have heard some portion of that conversation. She walked to the fence and stood on her side of it. He kept working, driving a staple with 3 precise strokes of the hammer. "You heard that," she said. "Of it," he said, and had the grace not to pretend otherwise. And he set the hammer on the fence post and looked at her. His gray eyes in the morning light were clear and direct and a little careful. "And I think you are a woman who knows her own mind," he said, "and that Tom Briggs has never in his life understood that about you." She looked at him. The space between them was the width of a fence line, no distance at all. "Is there something you would like to say to me, Mr. Watkins?" she said. She did not make it easy for him. She was not built for making things easy. He was quiet for a moment, and in that moment she could see him organizing himself, gathering his words with the same care he brought to everything. "I would very much like to call on you properly," he said, "if you are willing to entertain that." She felt the warmth of it move through her chest like the first water through a dry channel, slow and then faster and then very real. "I am considering it," she said. He nodded slowly. "Take your time," he said. "I am not going anywhere." "I know you are not," she said. "That is part of why I am considering it." She turned and walked back to her house, and she was smiling before she reached the porch. A small and private and entirely genuine smile that she kept to herself, though she suspected he might have seen some small edge of it before she turned. He began calling on her the following Sunday, coming after the church service that they both attended at the small white church in Clearwater, arriving at her door in the early afternoon with his hat in hand, and an occasional small offering, a handful of late summer wildflowers once, a jar of honey from the hive he kept east of his barn, a book he had finished and thought she might like, a collection of poems by a woman whose name Sarah did not recognize but whose words hit her somewhere quiet and true. They sat on her porch in the Sunday afternoons and talked. The conversations were never short. He had opinions about things that surprised her, and she had opinions about things that surprised him, and they disagreed on several points, with a mutual respect that she found more stimulating than agreement would have been. He was funny, quietly, in a way that emerged gradually, a dryness to his observations that rewarded attention. She found herself laughing at things he said, which she had not expected. In September, the corn harvest came in at 2/3 of a full yield, which was considerably better than she had dared hope for in August. She spent 3 days in the field bringing it in, and on the second day Peter appeared at her fence line without announcement and drove Moses and the wagon while she worked the rows, and they got 3 weeks of work done in 2 days between them. And when it was done, she stood in the middle of her cleared field with her arms at her sides and her chest full of something so close to pure relief that she had to stop and breathe for a moment. "Good crop," he said, coming up beside her. "Better than it had any right to be," she said. "It had every right," he said. "You worked for it." She turned to look at him and said very quietly, "We worked for it." And he smiled at her, a full and unguarded smile that she had not seen from him before, and she thought it was one of the finest things she had ever seen. The harvest supper at the church in late September brought the whole county together in the way that shared hardship and shared relief tend to do. Tables were set up in the churchyard, and people brought what they had: casseroles and pies and smoked meats, and the preserved things from their cellars. And there was a fiddle player and a man who played the harmonica, and the evening was full of the particular warmth of people who had survived something together and were grateful. Sarah arrived with a pot of her mother's preserved peach jam and 2 apple pies, and Peter arrived with a haunch of beef he had smoked over hickory, and they found each other naturally in the way that people do when they have already established, without fully acknowledging it, that they belong in each other's orbit. They ate together at the end of one of the long tables with Hargrove and his wife on one side and the schoolteacher, a young woman named Clara Holt who had come from Missouri the previous year, on the other. The conversation was general and easy, and Sarah was aware with every passing minute of Peter beside her, the nearness of him, the warmth of his arm when it occasionally came close to hers, the way his voice sounded when he was at ease. After supper the fiddle started up, and people pushed back the tables, and the churchyard became a dancing space, and children ran between the grown-ups' legs, and the night air smelled of wood smoke and late roses. Clara Holt danced with the preacher's son, who looked at her with an expression that suggested he had been waiting for this particular occasion for some time. Tom Briggs danced twice with a woman from the eastern part of the county and seemed mercifully to be redirecting his energies. Peter turned to Sarah and said, "I don't dance very well." "Neither do I," she said. "Would you like to not dance very well together?" She looked at him, and the last of whatever distance she had been maintaining between them, the careful, self-protective distance that she had cultivated out of years of doing everything alone and not wanting to need anything, simply dissolved like salt in water. "Yes," she said, "I would." He was not lying about his dancing. He was stiff and careful in a way that was entirely genuine and also somehow endearing, and she was not much better, having had limited practice in the years since her youth. They managed a slow and somewhat unorthodox circuit of the dancing area to a quick fiddle tune, and they were both laughing by the end of it, actual laughing, the unguarded kind, and it was in the middle of that laughter, under the September stars of Callahan County with wood smoke in the air and the fiddle going and all their neighbors around them, that he took her hand and held it, and she let him, and neither of them mentioned it, and it felt entirely inevitable. He walked her home that night, leading his horse and walking beside her through the mild dark, and at her gate he stopped and they stood facing each other in the quiet with the whole flat Texas sky above them. "Sarah," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name, which was not accidental, and she felt it in her chest like a struck match. "Peter," she said back, which was also the first time, and she saw what it did to him. "I have been wanting to tell you for some time," he said, "that I believe you are the most remarkable person I have encountered in my life, and I am saying that with full knowledge that you will argue with it." She pressed her lips together against a smile. "I am in love with you," he said. He said it simply and directly, the way he said everything without ceremony or excess, and it landed on her heart with the precision of something that has been traveling a long distance in the right direction. She looked at him for a moment in the dark. The stars were very bright. "I have been in love with you since you dug that channel through my field in the middle of the night without asking my permission," she said. He blinked. "That was 4 weeks ago." "I know when it was," she said. "You are remarkably efficient," he said, and the dryness of it made her laugh again, and then he stepped forward and kissed her very carefully on the cheek, just at the corner of her jaw, and she turned her face slightly so the second one landed at the corner of her mouth, and they both stood very still for a moment afterward. "Good night, Sarah," he said. "Good night, Peter," she said. He rode home, and she went inside and sat down at her kitchen table in the dark for a few minutes, not thinking anything particularly coherent, but feeling something very large and warm and real. And then she lit the lamp and went to bed and slept better than she had in months. October arrived cool and fragrant with turned earth, and things between them progressed with the same steady and purposeful quality that characterized everything Peter Watkins did. He was not impulsive or dramatic about it, which suited her, because she was not those things either. They were deliberate people who had both spent enough time alone to understand what they actually wanted rather than settling for whatever was offered. He kissed her properly for the first time on an afternoon when she had come over to help with the wheat field, and they had worked together in the mild October sun, until the light went gold and long, and they were standing at his porch washing the chaff from their hands in the basin by the door, and she turned to say something about the harvest count, and he was looking at her in a way that she had no answer for. And so instead of saying anything she stood still, and he cupped her face in both his rough-palmed hands and kissed her, and it was quiet and real and entirely right. She put her hands against his chest and kissed him back, and when they separated she looked at him and said, "That was a long time coming." "I am aware," he said. "You could have managed it somewhat sooner." "I could have," he agreed. "I was being respectful." "Respect has its limits," she said. "I see that now," he said, and kissed her again. In November he asked her to marry him. He did it at her kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon with the wood stove going and the smell of pine smoke in the air. And he did it without a ring, because he did not yet have one, but with a directness and sincerity that she found more valuable than jewelry. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to combine the properties and build something here that is ours together and that will last. I'm not asking you to give up anything. I am asking you to let it all become ours." She looked at him across the table and thought about her father's chair and her mother's hat and the crack that had run through her corn field in August and the sound of water running through it in the early morning dark. "Yes," she said. He reached across the table and took both her hands in his. "Yes," he said, as though making sure. "Yes, Peter," she said. "Absolutely yes." He brought her a ring from Abilene 2 weeks later, a simple gold band with a single small garnet, and it fit her perfectly, because he had thought to measure her ring size by borrowing one of her rings while she was not paying attention one afternoon, which she found simultaneously presumptuous and deeply charming. They were married in December at the White Church in Clearwater, on a bright cold day with frost still on the ground, and the sky so blue it hurt to look at. Hargrove and his wife were there, and Clara Holt, and most of the county, because most of the county had known this was coming before either of them had fully admitted it to themselves. Tom Briggs attended with the woman from the eastern county, whose name was Margaret and who appeared to find him entirely tolerable, which was its own small miracle. Sarah wore her mother's green wool dress, which she had taken in and pressed and trimmed with new white lace at the collar, and she carried a bunch of dried lavender and late rose hips tied with a ribbon. She walked into the church on her own, because she had no father to give her away, and she had decided that she would give herself, which felt appropriate. Peter was already at the front of the church when she came in, and when he saw her his face did something that made the whole church go quiet for a moment, a kind of open and unguarded wonder, and she walked toward it with her chin up and her eyes bright. The preacher read words she had heard before, but that landed differently this time, in this context, with this man standing beside her. And when he spoke the vows and she spoke them back, she meant every syllable with a fullness that surprised even herself. Peter put the ring on her finger with steady hands and said "I do" in a voice that carried all the way to the back of the church. And she said "I do" in a voice that was perhaps slightly quieter but was no less certain. And he kissed her, and the church made the particular joyful noise that small congregations make on occasions like this. The wedding supper was at Hargrove's store, tables pushed aside, the same fiddle player from the harvest supper playing from the corner, and this time Sarah and Peter danced every dance, still imperfectly, still laughing through most of them, and it was exactly right. They went home to his house, which had become their house now, and she had moved the most important things from her own house across the fence line the week before, her father's cedar table among them, which now stood in the corner of the kitchen beside his, and she thought it looked as though it had always been there. She stood in the middle of the kitchen in her mother's green dress and looked around at the combined space of their lives, his books on the shelf, her mother's jar of buttons on the windowsill, the herbs she had hung to dry along the beam above the stove, his good cast iron pan on the hook beside her copper pot, and it felt seamless in a way she had not expected, like two rivers meeting and finding they speak the same language. He came and stood behind her and put his arms around her, and she leaned back against him, and they stood in the warm kitchen in the December night, and she felt something settle in her, deep and final and entirely good. Winter was kind to them that year, mild enough to be manageable and cold enough to kill the insects that had been plaguing the livestock, and they spent it building what they were building, not just in the practical sense but in every sense. They learned each other in the close quarters of shared days, the rhythms of each other's mornings and the quiet of each other's evenings, the things that annoyed and the things that delighted, and the thousand small negotiations that two strong-willed people make when they choose to build a life together. She was more comfortable with silence than he had expected, and he was more talkative in the mornings than she was, which required some mutual adjustment. She discovered that he was an exceptional cook and a poor organizer of domestic spaces, and he discovered that she had strong opinions about the arrangement of furniture and none whatsoever about cooking methods, and they sorted this out between them with the practical good humor of people who have both lived alone long enough to be flexible about the things that don't matter. She kept her own land in her own name. This was not a point of conflict, but a point of shared clarity. He agreed that the deed remained hers, the inheritance of her father's work, and that they would farm both properties as one operation without obscuring the separate ownership. She had been prepared for resistance on this point and had none, which told her again something important about the man she had married. In February, she became aware of a change in herself that she confirmed with the doctor in Clearwater in March, sitting in the small examining room above the pharmacy with her hands in her lap, and the doctor, old Dr. Hennessy, who had delivered half the county, telling her what she had already suspected. She rode home in the pale March sun and went directly to the barn where Peter was repairing tack, and she stood in the doorway, and he looked up from the harness in his hands and read her face before she said a word. "What is it?" he said, setting the harness down. "We are going to have a child," she said. He crossed the barn in about 4 steps and took her face in his hands and kissed her forehead, and then looked at her with an expression that she filed away permanently in the place where she kept the things she most wanted to remember. "Are you well?" he asked first, because he was Peter, and that was what he asked first. "I am perfectly well," she said. "Good," he said, and held her for a long moment in the dusty barn air with the horses moving quietly in their stalls and the March wind coming under the door. "We need to expand the house," she said into his shoulder. "I know," he said. "I've been thinking about where to put the addition." "Already?" she said, pulling back to look at him. "I have been hoping," he said simply. She laughed and put her forehead against his chest, and he held her, And outside the barn, the early spring fields of their combined land stretched out in every direction, plowed and ready and waiting. The addition to the house was built in April, and May with help from Hargrove's 2 sons and a neighbor from the north end of the county who was a capable carpenter. It added 2 rooms on the western side of the house, a bedroom for the child and a larger sleeping room for them, and Peter finished the interior himself, insisting on doing the windowsills and the trim by hand with a care that she found excessive until she saw the finished result, which was beautiful. He also, in that spring, deepened his well and installed a proper pump, and extended the irrigation channel into both cornfields in a permanent configuration with wooden sluice gates that could be opened and closed as needed. He had designed it over the winter on paper, the way he had designed everything, and watching him implement it was like watching someone's interior life become real in the world. The channel ran from his well across both properties, branching to serve her original field and his wheat field and the combined kitchen garden they had established along the south side of the house, and it was elegant in its simplicity and utterly reliable. She told him one evening that he could have been an engineer if things had gone differently, and he looked at her with some amusement and said that he thought farming was engineering of the most demanding kind. He was not wrong. Their son was born in October of 1880, on a cool, brilliant morning that arrived so quickly and efficiently that Dr. Hennessy barely made it in time, and Peter spent 20 minutes of that morning in a state of controlled anxiety that Sarah, in between the less controllable parts of the process, found somewhat entertaining. The baby was healthy and loud, and had his father's gray eyes and his mother's dark hair, and they named him James, after her father. Peter held James Langston Watkins for the first time sitting in the chair by the bedroom window, with the October morning coming in golden through the curtains, and he held him with a care that was almost trembling, and he did not say anything for a long time, and Sarah watched him from the bed, and felt something so large and good and full that she was briefly overwhelmed by it. In a way, she had not been overwhelmed by anything since the morning she had found water running through her field. The year 1881 brought change to Callahan County in the way that years always brought change to the frontier, steadily and sometimes hard. The railroad came through the southern part of the county, which brought new families and new commerce and a general restlessness that some people found exciting and some found troubling. There were more disputes over land boundaries as the county filled in, and the county seat held more frequent sessions of the land court, and there were occasional difficulties with men who passed through the region without particular good intention. Peter handled one such difficulty in June, when a group of 3 men attempted to help themselves to a section of his northern fence and the cattle beyond it, late at night. He heard them from the house and went out with his rifle and a lantern, and had a short, direct conversation with them that resulted in their departing the county with considerable haste. He did not fire the rifle. He did not need to. Sarah, who had been awake and watching from the window with baby James on her hip, reflected afterward that there was something to be said for a man whose calmness was itself a form of authority. In 1882, they planted the largest combined crop they had yet attempted, expanding the cornfields northward and adding a sorghum section on the eastern edge of the property that proved remarkably profitable. The irrigation system that Peter had designed handled the dry summer, which was not as brutal as 1879, but was dry enough to remind them of what they had survived, with efficient reliability. The water ran where it was needed, and the crops came in well, and by September Sarah was looking at the account book at the kitchen table with a satisfaction she had not felt since before the drought. She was also, she had determined, expecting their second child. She waited until she was certain, and then told him at supper on a September evening, sliding the account book to him open at the crop income column, and saying simply that next year's figures would include another mouth to feed. He looked at her across the table with those calm gray eyes that she knew better than her own now, 3 years into knowing them intimately, and said, "Is that a problem?" "No," she said. "It is a considerable pleasure." He smiled and reached across the table and took her hand. And James, who was nearly 2 and had achieved a kind of locomotive independence that kept both parents in a constant state of alertness, pulled himself up by Peter's chair leg and reached for whatever was on the table with great purposeful concentration. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1883, on a day that arrived with thunderstorms and left with a rainbow over the eastern fields, which the people of Callahan County seemed to find very appropriate. They named her Ellen, after Peter's mother, who had died when he was young, and she had her mother's dark eyes and her father's quiet attention, and from the first week of her life exhibited a quality of observant stillness that made both her parents certain she would be formidable. The years settled into the particular rich pattern of a life built on solid ground. They expanded the house once more in 1884, adding a proper parlor and a covered breezeway connecting the house to the barn, which was Peter's concession to Sarah's reasonable complaint that crossing the yard in February was miserable. The barn expansion accommodated a small dairy operation that Sarah had been wanting for 2 years, and the milk and butter it produced brought them a steady supplemental income through the town of Clearwater's growing population. Clara Holt, the schoolteacher, married the preacher's son in 1883 as the whole county had expected, and Sarah became good friends with her in the way that happens between capable women who recognize each other, meeting on Thursday afternoons when the weather permitted to drink tea and discuss things with a candor that both of them found sustaining. Peter approved of this friendship entirely and occasionally said so, which Sarah found both unnecessary and touching. Tom Briggs married Margaret from the eastern county in 1882 and seemed genuinely content in a way that suggested she was exactly right for him, which was the best possible outcome for everyone. He tipped his hat to Sarah in town with a warmth that held no remnant of awkwardness, and she returned it in kind, and that, as far as she was concerned, was a perfectly satisfactory resolution. James grew into a serious and energetic boy who followed his father through the fields with an attention that was nearly comical in its seriousness, carrying his own small tools and asking a great many questions that Peter answered with the same patient thoroughness he brought to everything. By the time James was 5, he could name every tool in the barn by function and had opinions about the best plowing technique that were, Sarah thought, not entirely wrong. Ellen was different from her brother in ways that were clear from the beginning. Where James was physical and practical, Ellen was observational and linguistic, and she began asking to be read to at an age that surprised even her parents. By 4, she had memorized the poems in the collection Peter had given Sarah during their courtship, and recited them at the supper table with a perfect gravity that made both her parents conceal smiles behind their coffee cups. In the fall of 1885, when James was 5 and Ellen was 2 and Sarah was 32 and Peter was 36, he came home from a trip to Clearwater one afternoon with a look on his face that she had learned to recognize as the look of something he was figuring out how to say. She waited until supper was cleared and the children were asleep and they were sitting on the porch in the late evening air, and then she said, "All right. What is it?" He turned to look at her. The porch lamp made his face warm and familiar, and she thought, as she had thought at various moments over the years, that she was still struck by him in a way that she had not expected to be sustainable, and that seemed to be, in fact, exactly that. "Hargrove is selling the store," he said. "He's retiring, going to New Mexico to live with his daughter." "I heard something about that," she said. "He came to me today and asked if I would consider buying it." He paused. "Not alone. He suggested I might know someone with good business sense and the capital to go in as a partner." She looked at him. "He suggested me specifically. He said, and I'm giving you his words exactly, that Sarah Watkins is the sharpest mind in this county, and the store would be in good hands with her involved. He also said he'd rather sell to someone he trusted than to a stranger from Abilene who's already expressed interest. She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dark fields. The night was full of cricket song and the soft breathing of the animals in the barn. That would be a significant undertaking, she said. It would. On top of what we are already running. We would need to think carefully about the management, he agreed. Hire someone to work the floor. You would be more in the business side of it. She turned to look at him. You have already thought about all of this. I have had an afternoon to think about it, he said, but I wanted to think about it with you before I thought about it any further. She looked at him in the lamplight for a long moment. This man who had dug a channel through her field in the middle of the night rather than let her pride cost her something she needed. This man who had listened to her and argued with her and held her and built things with her for 6 years. This man who still looked at her, on ordinary evenings on an ordinary porch, like she was worth every ounce of attention he had ever given her. Tell me what you are thinking, she said. I am thinking, he said, that you have run a farm alone and run it well, that you understand accounts and inventory and the management of resources as well as anyone I have ever met, that you would be an exceptional business partner for the general store, and that Hargrove is right to want it to be you. And the farm, we keep it. We hire a hand or two as we have been discussing anyway. The farm runs and the store runs and we build something that will be here for James and Ellen. She looked at the dark fields again. She thought about her father's voice telling her that this land would prove itself. She thought about the morning she had stood at the fence with her hand damp from the water running in her field, knowing who had put it there, feeling something turn over in her chest like a key in a lock. All right, she said. All right. Write to Hargrove tomorrow, she said. Tell him we are interested in discussing terms. He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, and she laced her fingers through his and they sat in the night air, with the lamp burning low between them and the sound of the children sleeping inside the house, and the fields around them dark and rich and theirs. The purchase of Hargrove's General Store was completed in the spring of 1886, and Sarah threw herself into it with the same focused energy she brought to every enterprise she undertook. She and Peter bought it jointly, as they had agreed, and she took on the accounts and the ordering and the management of the floor staff, hiring a young man named Abel from the eastern county who had a natural ease with customers and a good memory for inventory. Peter built 2 new shelves along the back wall in his first week of ownership and reframed the door, which had been sticking since 1882. The store was the center of Clearwater's commercial life, and being at its center gave Sarah a vantage point on the county that she found both practically useful and endlessly interesting. She knew who was struggling and who was prospering, who was planning to expand and who was considering leaving, and she managed the store's credit with a fairness and a firmness that earned her a reputation across the county for dealing straight. There were people who found a woman in this role uncomfortable, because there were always people who found capable women in any role uncomfortable. But Sarah had been managing the opinions of such people since she was 20 years old, and she found she could do so without particular expenditure of energy. Peter, when such opinions reached him, addressed them briefly and directly and without drama, which she appreciated in a way she did not always express but that she felt consistently. James started school in the fall of 1886 and proved to be an excellent student who read voraciously and did arithmetic in his head with a speed that consistently startled his teacher, a new young woman who had come from Kansas and was both capable and deeply fond of him. Ellen, at 3, had declared that she intended to go to school also and spent the mornings during James's absence in a state of focused waiting, sitting at the kitchen table with a slate her father had brought her from the store and writing letters, with the careful attention of someone who views education as a personal mission. The spring of 1887 brought rain early and generously, a mercy after 2 dry springs in a row, and the combined fields of the Watkins property bloomed with a vigor that made Peter walk the rows in the early mornings with his hands in his pockets, and his face turned up to the sky with something she recognized as gratitude without reservation. She was pregnant again that spring, which they discovered in February and told James and Ellen at supper in March. James receiving the news with a thoughtful silence and a subsequent demand to know the logistics, and Ellen receiving it with the information that if it was a girl they should name her Rose, which she felt was an excellent name, and if it was a boy they might consider William, after the poem she had memorized about a man named William who had done something she admired, the specific content of which had become somewhat garbled in her memory, but the name had stuck. It was a boy, born in November of 1887, and they named him Robert, which neither James nor Ellen had suggested, and both accepted after some brief negotiation. Robert arrived with his father's steady demeanor and his mother's dark hair and the particular quality of a third child, which is an equanimity with chaos that his older siblings could not have manufactured, but that he seemed to be born with. The years moved forward with the particular momentum of a life that is full and purposeful and well-constructed. The store prospered, and the farm prospered, and the children grew with the openness of children who are loved and occupied and given room to be themselves. Peter taught James the irrigation system when he was 8, walking him through every sluice gate and every channel with the same patient thoroughness that James remembered his whole life. Sarah taught Ellen the accounts when she was 7, sitting beside her at the desk in the store's back room, and explaining the relationship between inventory and income in language that Ellen absorbed with the characteristic intensity she brought to everything she wanted to understand. Robert spent his early years between barn and field and store with the mobile cheerfulness of a child who is comfortable everywhere, acquiring friends and animals with equal ease and driving Moses, old Moses who was 17 by this point, and had achieved a philosophical patience with small children that bordered on the saintly, at a walk around the yard on Saturday mornings. In 1889, Texas was 10 years beyond the brutal drought that had tested so many families in this part of the state and driven some away forever, and the county had grown and changed and was growing and changing still, new families arriving. The railroad now bringing goods and mail and newspapers, and a connection to the larger world that had been entirely absent when Sarah had stood at her fence line in the August heat of 1879 and found a crack running through the heart of her corn field. She thought about that summer often, the way you think about the pivot points of your life, not with nostalgia exactly, but with a clear-eyed awareness of what they meant. She thought about it one evening in October of 1889, standing at the gate between what had been her land and what had been his and was now simply theirs, watching the last of the sunset dissolve into the enormous Texas sky. The irrigation channels ran, quiet and consistent, through both properties. The corn was already harvested, the fields standing open and resting. The lights of the house were warm through the windows, and she could hear James arguing cheerfully with Ellen about something inside, and Robert's laughter at whatever they were arguing about, and the smell of supper cooking. Peter came out of the barn and crossed the field toward her with his jacket over one arm and his hat pushed back on his head, and she watched him walk toward her the way she had watched him 100 times, still finding in it a pleasure that was undimmed. He came and stood beside her at the gate and looked out at the sky. "James says there's a frost coming," he said. "James is probably right," she said. "He has his grandfather's instinct for weather." "He does." Peter was quiet for a moment. "Are you all right?" She turned to look at him. "I am very all right," she said. "I was just thinking." "About what?" She looked back out at the sky, the last gold of it fading at the horizon. "About how different it could have been," she said. "If the drought had lasted another month, if the well had not been where it was, if you had been a different kind of man." He was quiet, listening. "If I had been a different kind of woman," she added, "one who could have asked for help." He turned to look at her then, and his gray eyes were warm in the fading light. "You would have found another way," he said. "You always would have found another way." "Maybe," she said, "but this is a better way." He reached out and took her hand, and she laced her fingers through his the way she had done 1,000 times in the years between that night and this evening. And they stood at the gate between their fields in the last of the October light, and the sky above them did what it had always done, stretched on vast and indifferent, and somehow also, in moments like this, entirely full of grace. "Supper will burn," she said. "Probably," he agreed. Neither of them moved for another moment. Then she turned and they walked back toward the house together, their footsteps easy on the path they had worn between the barn and the door over 10 years of living here. And the door opened before they reached it, because Ellen had seen them coming from the window, and held it wide with a 7-year-old's proprietary authority. And James was setting the table with the particular care he put into things he had decided to take seriously. And Robert was standing on his chair to reach the shelf where the bread basket lived. And the kitchen was warm and lit, and full of the smell of the stew Peter had put on that morning. Sarah hung her coat on the hook by the door and looked at all of it, and then she looked at Peter, who was hanging his coat beside hers, and he looked back at her with those steady gray eyes that she had been reading for 10 years and that still, on any given evening, had something new in them to find. "Thank you," she said quietly, just to him. He raised his eyebrows slightly in question. "For being a man who digs channels in the dark," she said. He smiled at her, a slow and full smile, and said, "Thank you for being a woman who notices." Sit down," Ellen commanded. "The bread is getting cold." They sat down. The four of them at the cedar table that had been her father's, and around which their lives had arranged themselves with the logic of things that belonged together. And they ate supper, while the October dark settled in outside, and the lamp made them warm, and the voices of their children filled the house with the particular music of a life that has been built carefully and well. Later that night, after the children were in bed and the kitchen was clean and the lamp was turned low, they sat together in the small parlor he had built with his own hands in the middle of the years of their life together, and she leaned against him on the settee, and he had his arm around her, and the fire in the small cast-iron stove made the room warm, and the October wind moved against the windows without getting in. She thought about the girl she had been at 12, following her father across this land for the first time and understanding without being told that this was where she belonged. She thought about her mother, gone too soon, and her father, gone too soon, and everything they had made and left her, and everything she had made of what they left her. She thought about the summer of 1879, and the sound of water in the early morning dark, and what it had been to stand at her fence, and know that someone had crossed onto her land in the middle of the night out of care for her and her crops, and out of something deeper than care. She thought about how pride and love are not opposites, how you can be too proud to ask for help and still receive it, how grace, sometimes, is something that comes to you in the night while you are sleeping, that changes the condition of your life before you are even awake to witness it, and that you spend years thereafter being grateful for. Peter's hand was warm at her shoulder. The fire spoke quietly. Outside, the fields they had built together lay in the autumn dark, the irrigation channels still and waiting for spring, the soil at rest, the fence line between what had been his and what had been hers, an invisible boundary through what was now and had long been simply theirs. She was not the kind of woman who said "I love you" with easy frequency, treating it like something that might be cheapened by repetition. She was the kind of woman who showed it in 10,000 ways across the years of a life, in the accounts she kept, and the preserves she made, and the mornings she rose before the sun, and the evenings she waited at the window, and the way she looked at the man beside her when he was not watching, with an attention and a gratitude and a fullness that was the honest sum of everything she was. But tonight she said it, turning her face up to his. "I love you," she said, "more than I knew how to love anything when I was young, which is a remarkable thing." He looked down at her in the firelight and said, "Sarah," in the voice he used for her name that still sounded like the first time, and kissed her, and held her. And outside the window the Texas stars performed their ancient and indifferent brilliance across the vast dark of a sky that had seen drought and rain, and all the small, determined heroics of ordinary people building lives in extraordinary country. And above the fields, the stars counted themselves out into the November cold, and the house held its warmth and its people, and its love with the solid and unassuming permanence of something built by hand on ground that had been chosen and earned and kept. The children slept. The animals slept. The fields rested. The well held its water deep and consistent in the dark earth, ready for whatever the next year would ask of it. And Sarah Langston Watkins, who had been too proud to ask for water and had found something far greater in the asking she never had to do, held her husband's hand in the firelight and was at peace, completely and unreservedly, for the first time in her life. And it was enough, and it was everything, and it was exactly right.